with public comments not on the agenda. Are there any public comments? Yes, sir. If you can come to the podium and state your name for the record.
My name is Steve Baskin.
It's on.
Steve Baskin.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I came here tonight to try to illustrate to you how you guys, or the city has created a parking ticketing system that creates a guilty verdict because it's an overwhelming burden on the citizen to find it. This is now the second time I've been issued a parking ticket for parking in front of my friend's household. I have the permit that corresponds with the area, but because the ticket had been issued, you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt without any ability to fight it reasonably. I called, I talked to people, I sent emails, I was told there's nothing we can do, come to court. So out of principle, I came to court. But the first time I came to court, it was simply for another court date. And at that point in time, I caved and paid the ticket because it's overwhelming for me to have to come to court twice and stand in front of a jury to simply state, hey guys, a mistake was made, I have a ticket. And the way that this is done, my assumption is that even someone with a handicap placard that may have mistakenly not properly displayed it would still be able to come down here and say, hey guys, a mistake was made. So while everybody's out there telling me there's nothing we can do, there's nothing we can do, I'm hoping that there's something you can do to prevent me from not being able to park in front of my friend's house. Because right now the deterrent's too high, I'm not going to go back. My daughter likes to play with his daughter, but I just don't want to go and pay $75 every time we make a mistake. I'm hoping that you guys can do something about this.
Thank you, Mr. Haskins.
Baskin.
Director Wade. Thank you, Director Wade.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor and City Council members. To start off our work session this evening, I'll just give you a preview of what is coming on this first agenda item. First, you'll hear from one of our audit partners, Abby Hagerman, about the results of the fiscal year 2024 audit. And then you'll hear from me, from staff's perspective on the audit, just some information I want to make sure that I train you on, pass on to the public, and then we'll dive into some of our activity from fiscal year 2024 and take a look at our new community financial report. And with that introduction, I will hand the mic over to partner Abby Hagerman.
Thank you, Ms. Hagerman. Welcome.
Good evening. Thank you, Director Wade. Thank you, Honorable Mayor and members of City Council. Welcome to the new faces. Obviously, some of you were not here during the financial statement audit, but you get to hear the results of it. So you're going to get the back end, and then I'll come back towards the fall, and we'll do the front end of things. But this is a really important thing that I appreciate that the city allows us the time to meet with all of you. As auditors, we oftentimes, are heavily involved with the finance department, and then we don't come talk to you, but you're the ones who hire us to ensure that we're meeting, compliance requirements, that we're in compliance with state statute. So this is important for us to be here. Thank you for getting this presentation pulled up. This was available in the packet. I'm not going to read it word for word because that's, you can read yourselves as well, but I'm going to go over these in high-level narrative to talk about what is this process, what does it mean, and where are we at. So, thank you. Perfect. So, professional standards require us to be here and talk about this. I mentioned before, we work often with finance, and we, sometimes as auditors aren't very good about coming down and talking to the council. At the beginning of the audit, you guys who haven't been here, I'll come back again in the fall and we'll talk about how we're going to plan for the fiscal year 25 audit that is currently, halfway over, so we're getting there. The communication helps us elaborate on what are we going to do, what are the expectations, what are the results of the audit that will come out of the work that we perform. We've audited, personally me, I've audited the city for a long time under lots of different firm names. This is our third under Klinger Hagerman? So third under Klinger Hagerman, which is pretty exciting. And as always, we look forward to working with the city. It's a wonderful experience, and the staff just does a great job. So the results of our audit. So we have completed the audit for June 30, 2024. We have to conduct the audit in accordance with auditing standards generally accepted in the United States, and because you're a governmental entity, government auditing standards. The financial statements are the responsibility of management and those charged with governance. The objective of the audit is for us to provide reasonable but not absolute assurance that your financial statements are free of material misstatement. I have to give and obtain reasonable assurance. I can't give absolute, otherwise I would look at every single transaction that happens inside the city, and obviously that's just not feasible. So auditing standards gives us tools and different approaches to apply a risk-based method to help us obtain that reasonable assurance about the financial statements. The scope of our work was described in the earlier planning communications, so if you want to see what I'll talk about in the future, you can look back at that planning communication from the fall. What happened in the audit? Exciting news. Year after year, we thankfully, and this year is no exception, are able to issue an unmodified opinion. An unmodified opinion is the best opinion that you can receive for a financial statement audit, because it does mean I was able to obtain that reasonable assurance that those financial statements are free of material misstatements, and that could be from all different things. That could be internal control issues, it could be that we have fraud or errors or those types of things. So we were able to do enough work to obtain that opinion of unmodified. We do have what's called an emphasis of matter paragraph in our audit opinion. That's something that we want to call to your attention. It's not just the standard report. And the emphasis of matter is placed this year because we'll talk in a little bit, because of the ERP implementation and our financial reporting inside of the city became better. We had some errors that were identified and they got corrected. But that's what that emphasis of matter paragraph discusses. This is the long-winded one that I am not going to read to you. The financial statements, if you've seen them, are really long. The city takes their financial reporting very seriously and participates and actually prepares a comprehensive annual financial report that goes to the GFOA for a certificate in achievement for financial reporting. So it's very big, and inside of all of this are some items that have to be presented because you're a governmental agency. So in a government, there's things that are called required supplemental information. That can include your budget information. Because we're a part of the Wyoming retirement system in the state, those entities have to report on contributions, their proportionate share of the net pension liability. Those items have to be there because without them, the governing body for Governmental Accounting Standards Board said it would be misleading if we didn't talk about those. The one thing to understand, RSI has to be there, but I don't provide an opinion on that. Now we went through and we ticked and tied and made sure that everything agreed with the underlying numbers, but as auditors we don't express an opinion or provide assurance over that RSI. Because we're preparing and looking at an ACFR, I guess I said CAFR, didn't I? A long time ago, ACFR, Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. Because we do that, there are also additional sections. There's an introduction section and a statistical section. We do not provide opinions over those items as well. But those components don't change from year to year when the city reports. So if you're new to the council, I would encourage you to get familiar with what that big giant ACFR looks like. So that you understand what's RSI, what is comprehensive what's the introductory information, so that you feel confident in what it is that when I come and talk are the reports that we don't have to provide that opinion over. So our responsibility for other information that's contained inside of there is the ticking and tying that I talked about. We don't perform audit procedures, but we do make sure that it's all in line and ties. Let's see here. We would bring to management's attention if we had any issues. So if for some reason something didn't tick and tie in the reviewing process, we would alert management and we would work through just to make sure it's a really solid reporting package. Significant audit matters. Every year when we come in as auditors, we have to look at the accounting principles and policies and estimates that an organization uses to help prepare their financial statements. The world of accounting is getting more and more complex as the city grows and engages in more complex business transactions, the more estimates there are. So we have to ask every year, and we look at the underlying assumptions that management has made to make sure that they're reasonable. It's not something outlandish, it's not unexplained, it's supported by historical data, information that's maybe similar to other agencies. And those significant accounting policies we look at. Now, if there were changes to those, then we would have to look at why did you change it? Did you get better information? Was there an error? Was there a new accounting standard that was implemented? But thankfully, this year was kind of a quiet year in the world of governmental accounting, and we didn't have any changes except for the implementation in the way that we presented the restatement, which is really just a bonus because it made it clearer and easier for people to read those financial statements. Now, some of our financial statement disclosures are more sensitive because they have a lot of that judgment involved, the estimates, underlying assumptions. And so we want to make sure that we call those to people's attention. And really this year, the most significant one that is kind of different than what we've seen is really this note 4F with respect to accounting changes and restatements. And that's just because it's different than we've seen in the past, and we didn't have any other big implementations inside of the GASB standards. Your financial disclosures are neutral, consistent, and clear. That's really important in financial reporting. It's a lot of information inside that report, and we need to make sure that we're ensuring that the report that we see is written so that a user of the financial statement at any education level can hopefully grasp the basic understandings of items. I kept talking about estimates. They're significant. More and more come every year. When I first started, there were probably a couple of these that were on the list down there at like accounts receivable and allowances. But the Governmental Accounting Standards Board changes and improves financial reporting every year. Because of the complexity of the things that the city participates in, you have some more estimates than maybe other entities do. When we look at that, GASB 87 leases, we have GASB 96, which is subscription-based information technology arrangements. Net pension liability has been around for quite a while now. That's a pretty big number inside of governmental financial statements. If there's an OPEB plan, which the city participates in, so all of these, we look at the underlying significant assumptions for these estimates. During the year that we audited for fiscal year 24, there weren't any significant changes to the assumptions associated with all of those estimates. So nice little status quo associated with that. Very happy to communicate to all of you. We are pleased that there are no disagreements that arose during our work with management or with anyone that we worked with inside the city. That's what we always want to hear. It's not always what we get, so we're happy to make sure that we thank Administrator Wade and all of her teammates that help us work through this financial statement audit. It's a lot of data, it's a lot of work, and we certainly didn't have any issues there. Everything that we requested was provided to us in a timely manner. There wasn't any holding back or not wanting to share information. At the signing of the audit opinion, when we release that document, management does have to make certain representations to us about the information that they provided us was fully to their knowledge, to the best of their ability. They were forthcoming, nothing was withheld. And that representation happened on December 19th, 2024. That's also the date that you will see on every letter inside of the big giant financial report, because that's the date that we substantially completed everything. So we're not quite at 60 days out, but we're getting there. But the December 19th date allows us to be pleased that we were able to issue it inside of state statute. State statute does require a municipality to be issued by 12/31 of every year, and that it hasn't always happened. Some things just happen, so it was great that this year we were able to do it. Also, for your Act for certificate, you need to be issued within 6 months of your financial statement date, so that was also timely as well. So that was a big win for all of us. It meant we went to Christmas without having to be worried about, did the submission go through, do we have anything left? We would need to notify you, and we would have to discuss with management. If we had found out that they were kind of doing opinion shopping, and I said, hey, this is how we interpreted, some GASB pronouncement, and they said, oh, well, we asked somebody else, and they disagreed with what you said. We weren't aware of any of those, and to our knowledge, those didn't exist during our time this year. If we had other audit findings or issues, we would report to you on those as well. There may be minor things when we're doing the financial statement audit that just, we say, hey, best practice is maybe this, here's what we've noticed and what we've reviewed. So we really do try to provide value-add services to our client, and audit is a commodity. If you're a municipality in the state, you have to have it. Doesn't matter, not your choice. So that's the one thing Klinger-Hagerman really prides themselves on, is we work closely with those in financial reporting to hopefully provide them with recommendations or suggestions, or if during the year they're implementing something and want to run it by us, that communication is there, because in the end it's just a benefit to the city to have those. Because you're a governmental entity, you not only have a financial statement audit, but you also have to, because you're under governmental auditing standards, have your internal controls over financial reporting reviewed. Something that is nice is that the city has such a nice internal control structure, which is followed, it is constantly reviewed, it's looked at from a risk assessment standpoint. We are, as auditors, able to rely on some of those controls. That means that we can run a more efficient audit, we can provide better feedback. We can't do that everywhere. So this was a great place for us. Every entity in the state of Wyoming that has an audit is going to have one of these if they're a governmental entity. It's just nice that we also get to rely on those controls instead of just looking at them like we do at some other places. Now, when we look at internal control, we're looking at the review process, the segregation of duties associated with various areas inside of the financial report. That could be compliance over laws and regulations. How are you capitalizing your assets? What's that big giant net pension liability look like? And if during our testing we become aware that like, whoa, what has happened? Something, there was an error made, something wasn't caught, or something was implemented and there wasn't an adequate control, then we would go through and we would do our testing and we would result in a letter that would identify the types of findings that are out there. Control deficiency, which you see is at the top level here, is the lowest one. That's not going to show up in a report anywhere. These are things that are best practices. Maybe it was something minor that just didn't happen. It was a one-off. So we can communicate those as auditors directly to management. We don't think they warrant the level of attention of a significant deficiency or a material weakness. Significant deficiencies and material weaknesses exist, even inside of great organizations that have good controls. We are human, and so implementing a system that involves humans could, unfortunately, just have errors that occur. So there are inherent limitations to internal controls, so even if there were a finding, it doesn't necessarily mean something is, the whole system is broken or there aren't adequate controls in place. However, for fiscal year 2024, we're happy to report we didn't have any significant deficiencies or material weaknesses to be communicated in our reports. Doesn't mean that maybe there isn't something out there, but the testing that we performed and the work that we did in compliance with governmental auditing standards did not identify anything. So that's always speaks to the quality and caliber of the tone at the top that exists with financial reporting. The last audit opinion that you guys get is a single audit. The single audit is the uniform guidance. This exists because the city expended more than $750,000 in federal expenses. That number is going to jump. We're going to start talking about $1 million instead of $750. When I started, it was, I think, $500. So slowly it's creeping up. It won't make a difference to you guys. You spend more than $1 million also. So the city is always subject to single audit. When we do the single audit, we are looking just specifically at federal awards, and we go through a really rigorous, matrix of how do we select which federal program to test. That program is tested for compliance requirements, and the goal is for us to provide an opinion to say that we presented all of the federal expenditures, we looked at all of the compliance requirements, and yes, they're in compliance, no, they're not. We were able to give an unmodified opinion. Again, that's the best opinion that we can get. The city spent, a little over $4 million inside of the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, the ARPA money on some capital projects during the year. So that information was tested with its material compliance requirements, and we found no issues. So that's always a great testament to the controls that are surrounding federal money. Obviously, sometimes it might feel like free money to someone on the outside, but there are always strings attached, and we have to make sure that the entity that we're auditing is truly making sure they're complying with those requirements. So that is it for me. This is restricted to those of you who are here tonight and listening online to understand the purpose of this report. It shouldn't be taken out of context. But we appreciate the city so very much in allowing us to continue services. The city, it's always a pleasure. We really, my business partner and I have worked for small firms, big firms, really big municipalities, and we would put your finance team against any one of those. It really is just fabulous. So at this point, I would open the floor if anybody has any questions or comments that I can answer.
Councilors, any questions or comments?
Heads are spinning.
Thank you very much.
thank you guys so much. Hopefully we'll see you guys in the fall. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Director Weir.
Thank you, Honorable Mayor. It's my pleasure to dive into staff's presentation next, but before I do so, I just want to acknowledge the tremendous work of the finance team, not only in fiscal year 2024, but especially in the years just preceding that. We have had so much change. You know, we have gone live with a new financial software, and to come out of that implementation with a lack of audit findings is not normal. And in my opinion, just demonstrates the exceptional work of our team. And I want to also let you know that Jen Malmberg is joining us tonight. She was really hoping to co-present with me, but unfortunately, she is feeling pretty ill, and it just continued to get worse as the day went on. And so she's joining us on the screen and in spirit, and is looking forward to being up here to present this report to you next year. But shout out to that finance team. They are still implementing software. So it may appear that things have calmed down, but there's still a lot of work to do, and I know that they will be really grateful for the day when the payroll and HR phase go live and things really do start to calm down just a little bit. City Clerk, if you will pull up the presentation for, yes, that one. Very good. If you'll go ahead and go to the second slide. So staff's work session tonight really has a few main goals. We want to make sure that we introduce you to our audited financial report, the ACFR, the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, in more detail. And we'll talk to you about staff's responsibilities. So you've heard about the auditor's responsibilities. I'm going to tell you from my perspective what staff's responsibilities are. You'll see that they align. We're going to highlight knowledge that is essential to using these reports. Thereby, we hope we increase accessibility. Although I will say, I know these are technical reports, and so we're just going to skim the surface this evening to hopefully pique your interest and make these things feel like something that you maybe want to dive into because we've given you a path. We will also provide you an overview of the sections of our Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, the ACFR. And we'll introduce you to our new Community Financial Report, which is meant to make the ACFR more accessible. So you'll learn more about that later, but that report is actually prepared using audited GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles measured data. And so while that report is not audited, it is prepared using audited data, and there are a lot of similarities. So it's really important. We're going to talk a lot about that. And finally, we're going to review highlights of financial activity for the year, not from the ACFR like we normally would, but from our Community Financial Report. And that's very intentional because that Community Financial Report really pulls out what I feel are some of the best nuggets of information from the ACFR, and of course we'll continue refining that report over time. So that's our agenda this evening. City Clerk, next slide. Thank you so much. Responsibility of the staff, as the auditor said. Management, that's us at the city. We are entirely responsible for preparing, recording all of our transactions during the year, making sure those transactions are recorded in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. You're going to hear me say that a lot tonight. We're going to call that GAAP. I will say that a few times until hopefully it sticks, but it's our job to make those measurements. It's our job to prepare the internal controls. It's our job to prepare the financial statements. We actually cannot delegate that to our auditors. It would compromise their independence. And if we do ever wish to have any accounting help, which we did ask for a couple of years ago, we cannot do that with our auditors. We have to contract with an independent firm so that that independence of our auditors is maintained. So really important to remember. I'll just pause for a moment. Very nice. I'll continue now. I also want to say that, I think we use the term, you probably have all heard the term audit preparation or audit ready, but many of you may not actually know what that means. And what that means is that, in particular, your balance sheet accounts are fully documented, so you can fully prove anything that's an asset, a liability, a deferred inflow, or deferred outflow of resources with documentation. It also means that your revenue and expense accounts, your income statement accounts, You're doing variance analysis, you've got internal controls that are running all year long to detect errors there, and you're making sure that those numbers are right. That's really what it means to be audit ready. It takes a lot of time to do that. It's not something that just happens overnight. And so I want to make sure you know, at least from a municipal government standpoint, what that means. Some of you may have experience with that in the grant world. There's a little bit more involved when you start to talk about an entire entity's financial statements. Next slide. A little bit more about GAAP, or FRIENDS, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. They are a set of standards and interpretations for accounting and reporting of financial transactions and events. They're promulgated by a standard-setting body. The Financial Accounting Standards Board is the standard-setting body for our private and not-for-profit entities in the United States, and the Government Accounting Standards Board sets standards for government entities in the United States. You may think, well, it's just a transaction. Shouldn't there just be one way to measure it? And really, if you were just looking at it from a cash basis, yes, that would be the answer. But that's not really the way corporate financial statements are prepared, publicly traded for sure, and especially financials of large organizations. And so over time, there have been standards set for the way you measure transactions to make sure that there's consistency in how those transactions are measured. And if you I'm sure many of you are aware of some of the accounting scandals over time. Most of those have happened in regard to the measurement of transactions and the inappropriate application of some accounting principle. And so really important to know that these things are out there, and they're designed to make sure that those financial statements that we produce are comparable. You should also know that standards have very much gone to a principles-based approach, really, I think, resulting from a lot of the frauds we saw in the early 2000s. And so less rules-based, more principles-based, although there's plenty of technical guidelines in an accounting standard. If you ever want to look one up, go to GASB.org and have some fun. They're long and detailed. And we don't have discretion about whether we follow GAAP. Wyoming state statute actually requires that we do because we're a municipality, and so we have to follow these guidelines. And finally, every year, GAAP, or FRIENDS, change with new implementations. The big implementation this year is related to the measurement of compensated absence liabilities. That will be a large one. Next slide. Why are GAAP important? Well, we really think it's important as accountants that you be able to trust the financial information in front of you, which means that we want to ensure that transactions are recorded similarly across entities that can be compared. That's what GAAP ensures. And that disclosures are a standard set, because you don't want to pick up a set of financial statements and have disclosures that are all over the place. It's really tough to use those. And so those standards are meant to create comparable financial statements that allow users to make good decisions. Of course, in the private sector, we know that that means whether, for a publicly traded company, we know that that means whether if someone wants to invest in that company. How do we make that determination? For government, the reasons are a little different. And we'll talk about that later. Next slide. We do have, as Partner Hagerman mentioned, an annual audit requirement. Here's the statutory reference. Just wanted that to be part of the public record, and we can continue to the next slide. And I'll go over some unique aspects of governmental financial statements. I'm going to catch up with you here. The use of fund accounting in particular is unique to government. And so as you get for some of our new council members in the public, as we get a little closer to budget season, you're going to hear us talk about the general fund, the recreation center fund, the water fund, the wastewater fund, etc. So in government, we segregate financial activity based on the restrictions on the use of those resources. The general fund, by definition, is the fund where everything else goes that shouldn't be accounted for in other funds, which is often why it's the biggest fund. And then all of our other funds represent some type of resource purpose or restriction, whether that's set by external, someone outside the government, or the government itself. We have two accounting bases in government. We have the accrual basis of accounting and the modified accrual basis. Very different than what you see in the private sector. It is my opinion that that fosters transparency and allows at least our governmental fund financial statements to be measured in a way that makes way more sense to most members of the public than an accrual basis financial statement, which requires a little more knowledge and training to decipher. We have a prescribed format for our annual report. And our success is not measured by profit, but how well we deliver essential services. Transparency, efficiency, sustainability in operations, and effectiveness are just some of the key concepts. And so when you're looking at a government's financial statements, you want to be able to start to assess those things, which is different than if you're making a decision about, say, am I going to invest in publicly traded company X? So the purposes of government financial statements are different. That's why the governmental standards are different. And I feel like that's important because in 2022, government spending in the US was 36% of GDP. So a pretty big section of the economy and specialized use. And so that's the context in which these standards developed. Before I get a little further into the after, I'm going to just take a pause and ask if any of you have any questions before I move on.
Councilors, are there any questions? Councilor Freed.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Director Wade. I have one question, and I could have looked it up on dictionary.com, but promulgated.
Promulgated.
Can you describe what that is?
Set by.
Set by, okay.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah. You know, that's one of those, I appreciate, through you, Mayor, I appreciate you asking, but that is definitely language you learn when you're passing the CPA exam. So that's good to be interpreted.
Thank you, Director Wade.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you. Continue, Director Wade.
So let's talk about what our ACFR is, the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. It's a standardized best practice format for our annual report. We have to have an annual financial statement. The contents of the financial statement we have to have are not all that much less than the ACFR, and so why not just do an ACFR and do the best practice and be able to submit it to, for example, the Government Finance Officers Association to participate in the Excellence Program and get great technical feedback. And so for a little bit more work, we really do achieve that kind of best practice benchmark, and we have been submitting to that certificate program for 47 years and earning that award for that time. We get great feedback from those technical experts. Some of it does result in changes to our financials, some of it we dispute. It just depends on the nature of the comment, but I am grateful for that additional feedback. And so I think it's important you know, we don't have to statutorily do an ACFR. We elect to do one because we feel that that cost-benefit ratio is really worth its weight and the extra effort it requires. Next slide. So when we talk about the ACFR, let's just take a beat for a minute and talk about what's in a financial statement. The answer to that is it really depends on the type of financial statement. I think you guys know there are two primary types, a balance sheet and an income statement. We could say a statement of cash flows is also a type of financial statement, but we won't talk about that here. But in general, you know, a balance sheet and an income statement, they're about as interconnected as something can be. One doesn't exist without the other, but they measure different things. So a balance sheet is going to have your point-in-time measurement, so as of the end of a fiscal year, for your assets, your liabilities, your deferred inflows and outflows, and in a government's case, instead of equity, net position and fund balance. Your income statement is going to, and that's for government, it's the statement of activities and the statement of changes in net position or fund balance. That's going to have the total for the transactions that occurred during a period. That period is the fiscal year, which for us runs from July 1st to June 30. I think many of you know we can't elect what our fiscal year is. State statute prescribes that for us. And so when you're looking at that income statement, what you should remember is that the changes that are quantified there represent the difference between last year's ending fund balance or net position and the current year's ending fund balance and net position. So that's why the two shall be always intertwined. So what's in a financial statement number? Well, that depends on the GAAP that's applied to that financial statement. So the generally accepted accounting principle that was used to prepare the financial statement. And this is what I want you to remember. Our government-wide financial statements, the first statement you're going to see in the ACFR, are prepared using the accrual basis of accounting. That's just like the private sector. It's the comparison. Our proprietary fund statements are prepared with the accrual basis of accounting. The government fund financial statements are prepared using the modified accrual basis of accounting, which is more similar to a cash basis of accounting, although it's not quite that. and it is more or less the basis on which we budget. So the really nice thing about those financial statements in the ACFR with the government fund financial statements is it's a close approximation to the same measurement for budgeted resources. That's why I love the modified accrual basis and really appreciate as a practitioner that it's part of our financial statements. There was some buzz a few years ago in the GASB about maybe changing like modified accrual, making it something different. And practitioners push back on that pretty hard because we feel like the current measurement really allows us to communicate what we need to communicate to our stakeholders without making it more complicated than it needs to be, and also upsetting that measurement and changing things once again. And so do be aware that what's in the financial statement number very much depends on the financial statement and a government report. And anytime, if you're using the ACFR and you have questions about this, whether it's council or members of the public, just give me a call. Happy to go over it in whatever kind of detail I need to. Next slide. Here's a comparison. I'm going to give you one example today. Yes?
We have a question. Vice Mayor Richardson.
Thank you. In thinking about that, from my understanding, that can be very confusing if I weren't sitting here right now and listening to it, trying to kind of wrap my head around like when and why. How do we simplify that message for people who just happen to look online and see this information, or our new online tool? What are we doing to try to kind of break that down so people aren't left with questions about how this all works, or is there how do you all do it?
Honored Mayor, through you, I think that a document like the ACFR is a very technical document that is meant to be read in its entirety. And if you were to do that, the answers to your questions would be there. This work session is one of the tools that we use to really talk about the different bases of accounting. We also talk about the different bases of accounting in our budgetary work sessions. But candidly, most of our financial reports are more on that budgetary basis, the modified accrual basis. That's how you're appropriating resources. And I think that's where a lot of the public interest is in. And so I haven't had a lot of questions over the years about the nuances between the technical accounting, because I'm not sure that there's a lot of public interest, if I'm being very transparent about how I view it. It isn't to say that we couldn't do better, it's that I think it's so off-putting. That's one of the goals of this work session, just to get that out, I'll be open and talk about it in an accessible way, but it is really hard to distill that in a way that feels accessible to people who don't have an advanced level of knowledge. And that's why I think the community financial report is actually very important. We don't talk a lot about the different bases of accounting. We talk more about things that I think people really connect to and understand without getting in these weeds that can maybe drive interest away even.
Great,
Thank you, Director Lee. Are there any other questions at this time? Continue.
Thank you. So to the Vice Mayor's question, just as an illustration, the accounting basis comparison I can give you is really, it boils down in a nutshell to how the value is measured. It's always about value in some way, and when the transaction is recognized. And so there are 3 examples on the screen today. I'm just going to go through one with you in detail, and it's the one that I think is the easiest for folks to understand. And that's the acquisition of a capital asset. And so let's just sit back and think about this for a minute. So on the modified accrual basis, or the way that you budget, let's think about the way you budget. You're budgeting that maybe we're going to go spend $50,000 to acquire a vehicle. On the modified accrual basis, and comparing that to the appropriation, we're going to expend those resources in the current fiscal year. $50,000 expenditure outlay. On the accrual basis of accounting, you would not do that. You would create an asset for $50,000, which would be on your balance sheet. If that car had a useful life of 5 years, you would amortize the cost of that car, the economic use of that resource, over the 5-year life, and you would see a $10,000 depreciation expense per year. And that is one of the simple examples. One could say the same thing for debt financing. So if we have, let's say we have some lease purchase proceeds, or maybe some SRF loan, an inflow. In a modified accrual approach, You would have that incoming, that inflow of resources, you would recognize that all in the period, and that would be a resource inflow, period. In the accrual basis of accounting, that incurrence of debt would create a liability, and the principal for that liability would be paid down over time as that loan became due. So very, very different. It's also why we have a government-wide statement, of course, that combines all of these things. And so you just have to understand that this is going on and know where you're living. And then, again, happy to offer any assistance. And if you all have some good ideas, if you think there's appetite to really dive in and explore these differences between the bases of accounting, I would love to hear some ideas for how we might be able to do that with the public. Okay, City Clerk, next slide. An ACFR is always going to have 4 report sections: an introductory section, a financial section, a statistical section, and an other section. What we put in the ACFR is absolutely prescribed. We don't have a lot of flexibility. We don't have flexibility there. It's a standard report. And so these are the elements that you're going to see in various ACFRs if you pick up one from across the United States. And next slide. So now we're going to get to introduce our new community financial report. However, I think what might be helpful is if we could just pull up the ACFR briefly for a moment. And this is mainly for our newer council members and members of the public who maybe haven't looked at the ACFR before. I just want to give you a visual. Okay, so the ACFR is about a 200-page document, which, you know, if you recall from some of our work on transparency, we think, you know, if we think about transparency as something that's actually accessible to someone, when you have a 200-page document that is highly technical, and our budget books are long, but they're written in language that isn't as technical. Technical 200-page documents, that's tough. It's tough to say, even though it's audited, even though it has this award, even though all these things are present, it's tough to say that that's a document that entices people to dive in. But I still like to think that people might want to. So I'm going to give you a path. So if I had limited time and I really wanted to just get an overview of the ACFR, I would recommend that you review management's discussion and analysis. That starts on page 12, so maybe let's just navigate there. And that runs from page 12 to page 36. So in these pages, you're going to get some condensed financial statements, you're going to get some neutral, fair language about why financial activity has changed during the year. We don't get to have opinions in the ACFR. It needs to be a neutral report, and so this is a really good space to see. Actually, Nancy, it may not be page 12 in the PDF. Let me find it for you.
Okay.
That's
You were right there. If you go forward about 3 more pages, right there.
Yes,
Keep
page
going.
25.
Keep going. Yep, right there.
Yeah.
Okay,
Page
thank you.
25. So over on page, numbering through the document, page 12 to page 36, I think I said, you're going to see the MD&A. That reads a little bit more friendly. It's really about the results of operations. I think most people would find that pretty interesting, and it is fairly accessible. You want to dive a little further in, continue to the next pages, which start on Nancy. For you, Nancy, for you, that's page 56. For users, it's page 37. You'll start to see our core set of financial statements. So this is where we have our government-wide financial statements, and you'll see them just back to back. Government-wide, fund financial statements, and more from there. If your interest is still piqued, because I'm an accountant, of course I'm going to say this, I highly encourage you to read the notes to the financial statements, because the notes to the financial statements are going to dive into those accounting standards in more detail. And so you, of course, don't have to read all of the notes, but if there's a type of balance that you don't really understand, you could skim those notes pretty easily and find information about the things that really don't make sense to you. The other thing you can do is give us a call. We're happy to help with names of balances that don't make sense. If you're like, what's a deferred inflow of resources? I mean, who's ever even heard that? which some things sound kind of like that. You can find it here, you can give us a ring. And so, just so you know, here's the landscape of the ACFR. And then, of course, if you want to read the whole document, I think that's the most fantastic thing ever. But I haven't met many people who have. So, Nancy will go back to the presentation from there. Which is why I am excited to introduce the Community Financial Report. So the Community Financial Report is also known as the popular annual financial report. It's the PAFR. We're going to call it the PAFR a little bit tonight, but if I was talking to a citizen, I would not call it that. I would call it the Community Financial Report because that's really who it was prepared for. Nancy, next slide.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're okay. It just all of a sudden I can't see it on my screen.
Doesn't it help that we had 6 attachments? Which, of course we did.
Sorry.
So while she's doing this, while she's pulling up the presentation, just for our newer council members, you know, when we get to our budget work sessions, those are you know, more financial heavy sections too. The tone and the tenor is really different. We're talking about the types of resources we have, the recommendations for spending those resources, and it does feel very different in this. This is our only technical work session of the year, and so I just want to, if any of you are maybe worried about that a little bit as you approach budget season, I want you to know the flavor is different, and we teach it in a different way.
I apologize, Jen.
No, it's totally fine. Perfect.
Nice work.
So the Community Financial Report really, it arose out of our transparency initiative because we realized transparency doesn't just mean surveys and connecting with the community to find out what they want. It means looking at what we have and how we can make it more open to the public. You're going to see a demonstration of open finance tonight, which I'm really excited about, which is also part of that effort. But our PAFR, our Community Financial Report, also sprung from the realization that that ACFR might be a little tough for people. And so we need to condense that down and distill it to its core elements. The great thing about the PAFR is that it is prepared. It's required to be prepared using audited information. And so you're going to see tons of connection to the ACFR, to those actual financial statements on the ACFR. And so hopefully that creates a feeling of trust and reliability, even though the PAFR itself is not audited. We did develop our PAFR to comply with the Government Finance Officers Association award program. I did submit that for consideration this year. We'll see if we get the award in the first year. I don't know if we will. If we don't, we'll get some great comments that will hopefully help us achieve it in future years. And I want to make it really clear that staff chose what to highlight in this report. We did that by looking at many, many PAFRs from across the country. Spencer, who will present later tonight, did so much of that work. And so we chose what we thought was particularly effective in terms of, and we also chose what we saw repeated really frequently. Because it's a good thing to rely on a professional body of work. And so you'll see some of those things reflected. And we took some guidance from our peers on what felt like was too gaudy and maybe what felt like would be a friendly report. And hopefully we created a report that felt accessible to the community, because what we noticed was each report seemed to have a certain type of flavor. And so we'll continue adjusting that over time. But we want this report to feel like Laramie in some ways. Next slide. So we do have a set of content. You'll notice that the content in this report is very different than the ACFR. We get to do a welcome and an introduction, for example. We talk about our form of government, the council's strategic priorities, some economic highlights from Laramie at a glance. We talk about our city services, and then we dive into that financial information, our net position, our statement of activities, our income statement, and things of that nature. And so it's a much more, for many users who may or may not interact with government financial information on a routine basis, I feel it's a much more welcoming entry into that, and it also gives them some context that, you know, we are a city council manager form of government, that the city council sets these goals, that they guide our spending throughout the year, that we have a budget, those types of things. And now we're going to dive into that community financial report. So I'm not going to highlight the entire report for you. So Nancy, it's just, this one is called Community Financial Report. But we are going to look at financial activity, some of the highlights in this report, just so you can see visually the difference compared to the ACFR and why we felt this was important. So this report is, just as Nancy's pulling it up, it's 17 pages. That's very different than 109 pages. Okay, so in my opinion, much more accessible to members of the public. And Nancy, if you will, let's just go to page 7. So the first 6 pages are really introduction. Page 7 is really where we start with our aggregated financial statements. What we noticed when we looked at PAFRs from across the country is all of them across the board started with the government-wide totals. There's good reason for that, because we know it's the same measurement basis. And Vice Mayor Richardson, perhaps that gets to your comment, right? So part of what we're doing is we're extracting information from the ACFR that can show people without having to explain a whole technical detail. So those government-wide financial statements are really important. We've chosen to present the government-wide balance sheet and the government-wide statement of activities. And what I'll point you to is the text just below the summarized net position statement on page 7. So Nancy, on page 4. Yeah, there you go. Awesome. And so what I've done here is I've actually just, this text is extracted from management's discussion and analysis in the ACFR. And so it's me pulling out from the ACFR the pieces that I feel are the most important to describe the changes in this way in our net position. And so if users wanted to make those connections to the ACFR, they absolutely could. So I'm not creating a lot of new text here. I'm just simply pulling out the most important things. And I'll give you an example of that here. So you can see in governmental activities that about, governmental activities created around 70% of the change in our net position for the year. Most of the change was in unrestricted net position and resulted from declines in the net pension liability coupled with strong period growth in unrestricted sales and use tax collections due to energy development in Albany County. And that actually describes a lot of the reason for the change in the year without having to go through 200 pages of text. I also love, and did you know, that I got to pull out things like, hey, did you know we have a building authority? Did you know that the activity for this building authority is blended in with 2 of our business type funds, the water fund and the solid waste fund? I doubt many people know that. City Clerk, if you could go to the next page, the statement of activities. Thank you very much. You'll see here, this is that government-wide statement of activities. And I'll just give you a sampling from governmental activities, the revenue summary. So our revenue in total grew by 7.9 million. That was 14% from the prior year. It was a very strong revenue year. $2.9 million of that increase was in specific purpose tax collections. That's due to one-time energy development in the area mostly. And $6.6 million of that growth is from collections in unrestricted sales and use tax. That's also due mostly to one-time energy growth. Only about $1 million of that is ongoing. And so 2 really major changes in revenue for the year. I also think it's a great time to point out that only $0.4 million of that increase is from property and auto tax revenue. And I say that mainly because there's so much conversation about property taxes now. And I made sure to include that here because I think it's relevant to our community and some of the conversations that are happening locally. And so these, again, are just me pulling out from the MD&A to customize this report while still explaining the high points of what's going on. You'll see in governmental activities expenses, those declined by $9.5 million. There was a $12.7 million expense reduction for expenses related to the pension and OPEB liabilities. That's pretty significant. Then we also had cost increases in personnel of $1.4 million across all functions, driven by the compensation adjustments that were given last year, as well as reduced attrition. Some of you may not know that in 2020 and 2022, 2023, we had a really hard time recruiting. And so our actual spending in many departments was very low compared to our budgeted totals. And so some of the increase is from that growth too. And so just another example of the high level presentation here. And so the standard I used is, am I pulling out information from that accurate that describes most of what happened in a way that the community would be interested in? And if you want a little more, that management's discussion and analysis, and the ACPR would provide that for you. I even had an opportunity on this page to nod to the compensation adjustments because I knew there was a lot of comment and interest in that, and so I took the opportunity to talk about that a little bit and tell people more about why that was done when the last one was done. And on the next page, you'll see information related to our business type revenues and expenses, and a graph that I really love. This is a graph that shows the citywide expenses, so all same measurement basis, and what we spend money on. So you'll see, top thing we spend money on at the city is police, at least in the government-wide measurement focus, followed by water, and then highways and streets. I also appreciate that I got the opportunity to start to dive further into activities that have traditionally rolled up in activities like general government, because honestly, I don't think many people would know what that is. And I think it would surprise folks to know that, with that $2.3 million expense, about